April 3rd, 1801. Mediterranean Sea. Pre-dawn darkness. Captain Thomas Cochrane stood on the quarterdeck of HMS Speedy, watching 50 Spanish warships materialize from the darkness like leviathans rising from the deep. His sloop, a vessel so small that most navies would have classified it as barely seaworthy, carried 14 4-pound guns and 54 men. The Spanish flagship Gamo, looming before him, mounted 32 guns, crewed by 319 soldiers and sailors, her broadside alone capable of reducing Speedy to driftwood in minutes. The choice was binary and brutal: flee and live with the shame of cowardice, or engage in what every naval manual, every tactical doctrine, every ounce of common sense declared to be suicide. Cochrane ordered his crew to battle stations. What happened in the next hour would become the most improbable naval victory in British history. A David and Goliath engagement so audacious, so technically impossible, that Napoleon himself would later call Cochrane the sea wolf who haunted my nightmares. This single action marked the beginning of a career that would see one man terrorize the entire Mediterranean and Atlantic coasts, invent modern naval warfare, cost the French Empire hundreds of millions in today's currency, and somehow, inexplicably, be almost entirely forgotten by everyone except military historians who whisper his name with something approaching religious awe. By the end of this story, you'll understand why Cochrane matters more than Nelson for understanding how individual genius can change the course of empires, and why his erasure from popular memory represents one of history's greatest injustices. But we can't just jump straight to watching Cochrane do the impossible. Without understanding the context of Britain's desperate situation in 1800, nothing about his audacity makes sense. Picture Europe in the final year of the 18th century. Revolutionary France had already devoured Belgium, Holland, Switzerland, and most of Italy. The guillotine's work was complete, the Directory had collapsed, and a brilliant Corsican general named Napoleon Bonaparte had seized power in a coup, proclaiming himself First Consul. Within 18 months, he would crown himself emperor. Within 5 years, he would control virtually the entire European continent. Britain stood alone. The numbers were terrifying. France could field armies of 600,000 men, the largest military force assembled since the Roman Empire. Britain's entire regular army numbered perhaps 40,000, scattered across global garrisons from India to the Caribbean. France's population exceeded 27 million. Britain's barely reached 10 million. France controlled the agricultural and industrial resources of half a continent. Britain was an island dependent on imported food and raw materials. The Royal Navy provided Britain's only advantage, and it was under existential threat. Here's why. Napoleon wasn't stupid. He understood perfectly that he could never invade Britain while the Royal Navy controlled the seas. But he also understood that naval warfare had become a brutal mathematical equation. France and her allies, Spain, Holland, Denmark, could together muster approximately 150 ships of the line against Britain's 175. Close enough to contest control. Close enough to matter. In 1800, France was building ships at an unprecedented rate at harbors from Toulon to Antwerp. Spanish shipyards at Ferrol and Cartagena worked day and night. If Napoleon could concentrate his scattered fleets, achieve local superiority for just 2 weeks, he could convoy 150,000 veteran troops across the Channel and end Britain's war in a fortnight of street fighting in London. The British Admiralty understood this calculus with crystalline clarity. Admiral Lord St. Vincent, First Lord of the Admiralty, wrote in 1801, "I do not say the French cannot come. I say only that they cannot come by sea." But even St. Vincent knew the margin was thinner than his public confidence suggested. Britain's strategy relied on blockade, keeping French and Spanish fleets bottled up in their harbors through constant presence, what Nelson called the far-distant storm-beaten ships upon which the Grand Army never looked, that nonetheless stood between it and the dominion of the world. But here's the problem. Blockading required ships, lots of ships, big ships, expensive ships, ships of the line with 74 or 100 guns. Every major French port required at least 3 or 4 capital ships maintaining station offshore, in all weather, all year. The mathematics were brutal. To keep 3 ships on station required 9 ships total, 3 on station, 3 in port refitting, 3 in transit. The Royal Navy simply didn't have enough ships of the line to blockade every port and maintain global commitments and keep a reserve for decisive battle. This is where smaller vessels entered the equation: frigates, sloops, brigs, cutters. These ships couldn't stand in the line of battle against enemy capitals, but they could raid, scout, disrupt, interdict, and generally make life hell for enemy commerce and coastal installations. Every merchant ship they captured, every supply convoy they destroyed, every harbor they terrorized, represented resources Napoleon couldn't use to build his navy, feed his armies, or fund his conquests. The problem was that frigate and sloop warfare was dangerous, unglamorous work that rarely led to promotion or prize money. Most captains treated it as a tedious duty to endure before returning to the glory of fleet actions. Coastal waters were treacherous, defended by shore batteries, and patrolled by enemy frigates often superior in force. And that's exactly what terrified Napoleon's admirals about Thomas Cochrane. There was one man who thought differently about what a small ship could accomplish. His name was Thomas Cochrane, and when HMS Speedy materialized off the Spanish coast on April 3, 1801, he was barely 25 years old and already legendary among Mediterranean sailors, both British and enemy, as either a tactical genius or a suicidal maniac, depending on whom you asked. Cochrane came from Scottish aristocracy, but the impoverished kind. His father, the 9th Earl of Dundonald, held one of Scotland's oldest titles and exactly 0 money to accompany it. The family estate, Colross Abbey, was mortgaged beyond redemption. His father spent decades trying to develop industrial schemes, coal tar distillation mostly, that consistently lost money while demonstrating genuine scientific insight. Thomas grew up watching brilliant ideas produce financial disaster, a lesson he would internalize deeply. Genius without resources meant nothing. Born in 1775, Cochrane joined the Royal Navy at age 17. Extraordinarily late by the standards of the day when most officers entered at 12 or 13. This late start marked him as an outsider from the beginning. He lacked the patronage networks, the social connections, the comfortable relationships with powerful admirals that smoothed careers. What he possessed instead was 6'2" of red-headed Scottish fury, a mathematical mind that could calculate trajectories and angles instantly, and absolute fearlessness bordering on pathology. His early career was undistinguished. He served aboard HMS Hind, then HMS Thetis, learning seamanship and gunnery, but showing no particular brilliance. What changed him was service under Captain Alexander Cochrane, a distant relative, aboard HMS Barfleur in 1795-1796. Alexander Cochrane was an aggressive, innovative officer who believed in close-range action and unconventional tactics. Thomas absorbed these lessons like a sponge. In 1796, Cochrane passed his lieutenant's examination and received his commission. He was 21 years old, painfully aware that most of his peers had been lieutenants since 16 or 17. He needed to distinguish himself, and quickly. His opportunity came in 1798 when he was appointed to HMS Barfleur again, this time under Captain Sir Hyde Parker. During the campaign against Tenerife, Cochrane demonstrated the quality that would define his career. He actually thought about what he was doing. While other officers simply followed orders and hoped for the best, Cochrane studied enemy positions, calculated fields of fire, estimated response times, and developed plans based on analysis rather than tradition. In one engagement off the Spanish coast, Cochrane took command of a prize crew sailing a captured vessel back to port. A Spanish frigate intercepted them. Rather than surrender or be sunk, Cochrane analyzed the situation. The Spaniard was faster and more heavily armed, but assuming Cochrane would run. not fight. Instead, Cochrane turned directly toward the frigate, ran up Spanish colors, and sailed so close alongside that the Spanish captain could see his supposed Spanish crew on deck. By the time the Spanish realized their error, Cochrane had gained sufficient lead to escape. It was a minor incident, but it revealed something crucial. Cochrane understood that naval warfare was fundamentally psychological. Ships were platforms for men, and men operated on expectations, assumptions, and emotions. Violate those expectations, and even superior force could be neutralized. In 1800, Cochrane's patron, Lord Keith, appointed him to command HMS Speedy. This was not, to be clear, a promotion anyone else wanted. Speedy was a brig sloop, 158 tons, 78 feet long, 14 4-pound guns. The 4-pound designation meant each cannonball weighed 4 pounds. By comparison, a frigate carried 18 or 24-pound guns. A ship of the line mounted 32 or 42-pound guns. Speedy's entire broadside, all 7 guns firing simultaneously, delivered less metal than a single gun on a ship of the line. The vessel was so small that Cochrane, at 6'2", couldn't stand upright anywhere below deck. He literally had to remain bent over or seated at all times in his own cabin. The crew of 54 lived in conditions that would make a slave ship look spacious. There was no glory in commanding Speedy, no prize money, no path to promotion. Cochrane thought it was perfect. Here's what he saw that others missed. Speedy was fast, maneuverable, and expendable. She drew so little water she could operate in shallows where frigates couldn't follow. She was too small to be worth the attention of enemy ships of the line, but large enough to menace merchant traffic. And most importantly, nobody expected a vessel that size to do anything significant, which meant every enemy captain would underestimate whatever Speedy attempted. By March 1801, Cochrane had been in command for 14 months. In that time, Speedy had captured or destroyed 53 enemy vessels, an average of 1 every 8 days. The Spanish called him El Diablo. French sailors knew him as Le Loup Cervier, the Sea Wolf. The Admiralty knew him as a statistical impossibility, and he was just getting started. By early 1801, Cochrane had concluded that the rules of naval engagement as practiced by both sides were fundamentally stupid, and that any captain willing to violate them systematically could achieve results out of all proportion to their actual force. On the morning of April 3, 1801, all of Cochrane's theories were about to face their ultimate test. HMS Speedy was cruising off Barcelona, hunting for merchant convoys, when the lookout spotted sails to the southwest. Lots of sails. What emerged from the morning haze was Gamo, a Spanish xebec frigate of 32 guns and 319 men. Let's be clear about the mathematics of this situation. Gamo displaced 600 tons to Speedy's 158. She mounted 32 guns, a mixture of 8, 12, and 18-pounders against Speedy's 14 4-pounders. Her broadside delivered approximately 190 pounds of metal. Speedy's delivered 28 pounds. She carried 319 men. Speedy carried 54. She stood 15 feet higher, out of the water, giving her cannon a commanding angle of fire. Her captain, Don Francisco de Torres, was an experienced officer with a reputation for aggression. By every mathematical calculation, every tactical doctrine, every precedent in naval history, HMS Speedy should have fled immediately. A sloop engaging a frigate was suicide. The gunnery disparity alone made victory impossible. One broadside from Gamo would reduce Speedy to floating wreckage, and Cochrane couldn't run. Gamo was faster with the current wind. She would catch Speedy within 2 hours and blow her apart from a distance. Most commanders would have surrendered. Don Francisco de Torres certainly expected surrender. Spanish naval regulations allowed for honorable capitulation when facing overwhelming force. Cochrane could have struck his colors, been exchanged in a prisoner swap within months, and faced no disgrace whatsoever. Everyone would have understood. But Cochrane was calculating different numbers. Gamo's advantages were real, but not absolute. Her height advantage meant her guns were designed for long-range engagement, angled downward. Get close enough, literally alongside, and those guns couldn't depress far enough to hit Speedy's low deck. Her larger crew was mostly soldiers, not sailors, trained for land combat and boarding actions, but not for naval gunnery. Her size meant she was less maneuverable. In close quarters, Speedy's smaller turning radius might matter. Most crucially, Don Francisco would be expecting either flight or surrender. He wouldn't be expecting Speedy to do something completely insane. Cochrane called his crew together. 54 men crowded onto Speedy's tiny deck. He explained the situation with brutal honesty. They were outnumbered to 6-1, outgunned by an even worse margin, and could neither outrun nor outfight their opponent by conventional means. Then he explained his plan. It was completely mad. He would close to point-blank range, literally alongside Gamo, so close their hulls would almost touch. At that range, Gamo's height advantage became a weakness. Her guns couldn't depress far enough. Speedy's 4-pounders, shooting upward, would rake Gamo's deck. The Spanish would attempt to board, expecting to overwhelm Speedy's tiny crew through sheer numbers, but Cochrane wouldn't let them. Instead, he would engage in what he called controlled chaos, make the Spanish believe they were boarding, fall back from the rail, let Spanish sailors pour onto Speedy's deck, then have the crew emerge from below and drive them back while a select team used the confusion to board Gamo from her less defended stern. It was an enormous gamble. If the Spanish maintained discipline, if they rushed Speedy all at once, if they simply shot everyone from above before attempting to board, if any one of 1,000 things went wrong, every man aboard Speedy would be dead or captured within minutes. Cochrane's sailing master, a grizzled veteran named James Parker, asked the obvious question, "And if the Spanish don't board, sir?" Cochrane smiled. "Then we're all going to die. But they will board. I'm counting on it." He was risking his ship, his career, his crew. Everything on his psychological understanding of Spanish naval doctrine and his ability to manipulate an enemy captain's expectations and ego. The crew voted. 54 men chose to follow their captain into what every rational observer would call suicide. Speedy turned toward Gamo and ran out her guns. What happened over the next hour combined Cochrane's brilliant preparation with moment-by-moment improvisation under conditions of absolute chaos. At 9:30 a.m., Gamo fired her opening broadside from 600 yards. 21 guns spoke in a rippling thunder. Iron shots screamed across the water. Most missed, throwing up massive geysers around Speedy, but 3 balls struck home, one punching completely through the brig's thin hull amidships, miraculously hitting nothing vital. 2 more shredding rigging. Cochrane did not return fire. Instead, he ordered Speedy to close the range while taking evasive action, tacking back and forth across Gamo's approach vector, making himself as difficult a target as possible while eating up the distance. This was psychologically brilliant. Don Francisco expected Speedy to either flee or fight at maximum range, trying to hurt Gamo before being destroyed. Instead, Cochrane was closing, apparently suicidally. Don Francisco assumed Cochrane must have reinforcements coming. No rational captain would act this way alone. He held his next broadside, scanning the horizon for British frigates. There were none. But those crucial seconds of hesitation allowed Speedy to close another 100 yards. At 300 yards, Don Francisco fired again. This broadside was better aimed. 5 balls struck Speedy. 1 killed 2 men at the forward gun. Another destroyed the ship's wheel, forcing Cochrane to steer using the emergency tiller from below deck, communicating through a complicated system of voice tubes and signals. But Speedy kept coming. At 9:50 a.m., with the range now just 100 yards, Cochrane made his first deception play. He ordered American colors raised, the stars and stripes. Spain wasn't at war with the United States. In the seconds of confusion while Don Francisco tried to process this information, Speedy closed to within 50 yards. Don Francisco realized the deception and ordered another broadside. But now, Cochrane's course corrections paid off. Speedy was approaching Gamo's bow, where only a few guns could bear. The broadside was ragged, poorly aimed, and mostly ineffective. At 40 yards, Cochrane struck the American colors and raised British colors. This wasn't just about correct naval etiquette, it was psychological warfare. He was demonstrating that he was in control, thinking clearly, manipulating the Spanish like chess pieces. At 20 yards, Cochrane ordered his final approach. He was going to do something no naval. Manual recommended. Bring Speedy alongside Gamo on the starboard side, matching course and speed, with hulls separated by less than 10 feet of water. Don Francisco saw Cochrane's intention. He ordered his gun crews to depress their cannon as far as possible and fire on the downward angle. But here, physics betrayed the Spanish. Gamo's guns simply couldn't depress far enough. The balls screamed over Speedy's low deck, shredding sails and rigging, but missing the hull and crew. At 10:05 a.m., the vessels came alongside, separated by barely 8 feet. Cochrane ordered his 7 starboard guns to fire simultaneously, maximum elevation, loaded with double shot and langrage, irregular pieces of metal that spread like shotgun pellets. The broadside erupted upward into Gamo's deck from below. At this range, with this angle, even 4-pound guns were devastating. Langrage spread across Gamo's deck like a deadly metal rain, killing or wounding dozens of Spanish sailors and soldiers packed along the rail. The Spanish returned fire with muskets. Over 300 men fired down into Speedy's tiny deck, the air filled with lead. Men screamed and fell, but Cochrane had already ordered his crew to take cover below the bulwarks, presenting minimal targets. Speedy's guns fired again, and again. Cochrane had trained his crews to reload and fire in less than 90 seconds. Extraordinary speed for 4-pounders. The Spanish couldn't match this rate of fire. Their larger guns required more time to reload, and the downward angle made the process awkward and dangerous. After 5 minutes of this exchange, Gamo's deck was a slaughterhouse. Bodies lay everywhere. The Spanish captain, Don Francisco de Torres, made his fatal decision. He ordered boarding parties to assemble. He would end this with cold steel. Cochrane was waiting for this. He wanted the Spanish to board. At 10:12 a.m., the Spanish launched their first boarding attempt. 50 soldiers and sailors swarmed across, throwing grappling hooks, laying planks between the vessels, jumping the narrow gap. They hit Speedy's deck like an avalanche, and found almost nobody there. Cochrane had withdrawn his crew below deck, leaving only a skeleton force visible. The Spanish, expecting resistance, instead found themselves crowding onto Speedy's tiny deck, unopposed, confused. That's when Cochrane sprung his trap. His crew erupted from below, not to fight the boarders, but to cut the grappling lines holding the ships together. Simultaneously, Speedy's helmsman, steering by emergency tiller, put the helm over hard. The two ships began to separate. The Spanish boarding party suddenly found themselves stranded on Speedy, cut off from their ship, outnumbered by Cochrane's crew, who had been waiting below deck with cutlasses, pikes, and pistols. The fight was short and brutal. The Spanish surrendered within 3 minutes. But Cochrane's real masterstroke was happening at Gamo's stern. While the Spanish focused on their boarding attempt, Cochrane had positioned his most trusted men, 18 sailors, at Speedy's bow. As the ships separated, these men didn't fight the Spanish boarders. Instead, they used the confusion to board Gamo from her less defended stern quarter, where most defenders had moved forward to support the boarding attempt. 18 British sailors swarmed onto Gamo's quarterdeck. They immediately struck for the Spanish colors, the flag flying from the stern. In naval combat, striking your colors, hauling down your flag, was the universal signal of surrender. Cochrane's men hauled down Gamo's Spanish ensign. On Gamo's deck, the Spanish crew saw their colors fall. In the smoke and chaos, they assumed their captain had surrendered. The fighting stopped. Men lowered their weapons. Officers shouted for confirmation. By the time Don Francisco understood what had happened, that a tiny boarding party had taken his quarterdeck through deception, it was too late. His crew's will to fight had evaporated. The psychological impact of seeing their colors struck, even through trickery, was overwhelming. At 10:25 a.m., exactly 55 minutes after the first shot was fired, Don Francisco de Torres formally surrendered his ship. The statistics were staggering. HMS Speedy, 158 tons and 54 men, had captured the Spanish frigate Gamo, 600 tons and 319 men. The casualty figures reflected the audacity. Speedy had lost 3 killed and 18 wounded. Gamo had lost 15 killed and 41 wounded, testament to Cochrane's devastating close-range broadsides, but raw numbers don't capture the significance. Cochrane had won by violating every rule of naval engagement, by manipulating enemy psychology, by understanding that warfare wasn't about pure mathematics, but about human behavior under stress. The British Navy was about to discover they had a weapon unlike anything they'd ever deployed before. Word of Speedy's capture of Gamo spread through the Mediterranean fleet like wildfire. Initially, most officers didn't believe it. A 14-gun sloop capturing a 32-gun frigate wasn't merely unlikely, it was supposed to be impossible. Only after Cochrane sailed Gamo into Port Mahon with Spanish prisoners aboard did the Admiralty accept what had happened. Admiral Lord Keith, commanding the Mediterranean fleet, summoned Cochrane to his flagship. What happened in that meeting reveals everything about both men. Keith was a traditional officer, competent, by the book, deeply suspicious of anything irregular. He studied Cochrane like a specimen in a jar, this impossibly young captain who had just rewritten naval tactical doctrine. "Explain to me," Keith said, "how you took a frigate with a sloop." Cochrane's response was characteristically direct. "I didn't take a frigate with a sloop, sir. I took a frigate with psychology. The Spanish expected me to behave rationally. I didn't. That was my entire advantage." Keith frowned. This wasn't how naval officers were supposed to think. But Keith was also smart enough to recognize value when he saw it. He promoted Cochrane to post captain, the crucial rank that put him on the path to eventually becoming an admiral. More importantly, he gave Cochrane the one thing every aggressive captain craved: freedom of action. "I'm assigning you independent cruising authority," Keith told him. "Terrorize the Spanish coast. Destroy their merchant marine. Make them afraid to leave harbor. I don't care how you do it." This was December 1801. Over the next 3 years, Cochrane would transform coastal warfare so completely that Napoleon would develop an obsessive personal hatred of this one British captain. But first, Cochrane needed a proper ship. Speedy, for all her success, was too small for what Cochrane was planning. In late 1801, he was given command of HMS Arab, a 20-gun post ship, still a small vessel, but a significant upgrade. Then, in 1805, he received HMS Pallas, a 32-gun frigate. Finally, in 1806, came HMS Imperieuse, a 38-gun frigate, and the ship that would become synonymous with Cochrane's reign of terror. Imperieuse was perfect for Cochrane's purposes: fast, maneuverable, heavily armed enough to engage shore batteries, and shallow-drafted enough to operate close to the coast. She carried 284 men, enough to launch cutting-out expeditions and raids without leaving the ship undermanned. Cochrane took Imperieuse to the French Mediterranean coast and proceeded to wage war in a way that violated every convention. First, he abandoned the traditional frigate role of commerce raiding at sea. Instead, he brought the war directly to enemy harbors, beaches, and coastal roads. On May 12, 1806, Cochrane spotted a French convoy proceeding along the coast near Sète, modern Sète. The convoy was hugging the shore, protected by shore batteries and a coastal fortress. Standard naval doctrine said you couldn't attack it. The shore batteries could fire on your ship while you were vulnerable, and even if you destroyed the convoy, you'd take unacceptable damage. Cochrane studied the situation and identified a flaw in the French defensive position. The shore batteries were sighted to fire at ships approaching from the sea, not from along the coastline. If he could get between the convoy and the shore, the batteries couldn't fire without hitting their own ships. He sailed Imperieuse directly toward the beach at full speed, threading between the convoy and the shore at a range of less than 200 yards from the beach. The shore batteries opened fire, but, as Cochrane had calculated, their geometry was all wrong. Most shots went high. Those that didn't went low and hit the water between Imperieuse and the French merchant ships. Imperieuse's guns fired systematically, raking the convoy from a range so close that missing was almost impossible. Within 30 minutes, Cochrane had destroyed 3 merchant ships and damaged 4 more. The French garrison could only watch in fury as this single British frigate operated with impunity in waters they'd considered absolutely safe. The Sete raid established Cochrane's methodology. Analyze the geometry of defensive positions, identify the angles they couldn't cover, exploit those angles ruthlessly. It was the naval equivalent of a boxer studying film to find the gaps in an opponent's defense. Over the next 2 years, Cochrane perfected his techniques. He would appear off a French harbor at dawn before the garrison was fully awake. He would land raiding parties that would spike guns in coastal batteries, driving iron spikes into the touch holes so the cannons couldn't be fired, burn signal stations, cut maritime telegraph lines, and generally create chaos before withdrawing. He would return 2 nights later, 50 miles down the coast, and do it again. The psychological impact was devastating. French coastal garrisons never knew where Cochrane would strike next. They had to maintain constant vigilance across hundreds of miles of coastline. Merchants refused to ship goods by coastal transport. Insurance rates for Mediterranean shipping skyrocketed. Napoleon received daily reports of Le Loup Cervier destroying French commerce, each report making him angrier. In April 1808, Cochrane executed his most audacious raid yet. A French convoy of supply ships, escorted by 3 gunboats and protected by shore batteries, was anchored in the roads of the Étang de Bages, near Narbonne. The position was considered impregnable. Shallow water prevented line of battleships from approaching, shore batteries covered all approaches, and the gunboats could maneuver in the shallows. Cochrane analyzed the situation for 2 days, sailing back and forth just outside cannon range, clearly visible to French observers. The French assumed he was simply scouting, perhaps trying to lure the convoy out to deeper water. On the night of April 14th, Cochrane launched his attack from an unexpected direction, overland. He landed a force of 140 Marines and sailors on a beach 5 miles from the French position, marching them across country in darkness. At dawn, they hit the shore batteries from behind, from the land side, where the fortifications faced seaward. The French gunners, who had been watching Imperieuse offshore, never saw the attack coming. The raiding party spiked the guns, destroyed the powder magazines, and withdrew before French reinforcements could arrive. With the shore batteries neutralized, Cochrane brought Imperieuse into the anchorage and systematically destroyed the entire convoy, 14 merchant vessels and 3 gunboats, while French troops on shore could only fire muskets uselessly at a ship 300 yards offshore. The Bages raid encapsulated everything that made Cochrane terrifying to Napoleon's forces. He didn't fight fair, he didn't follow rules, and he didn't accept that impossible meant anything more than requires creative thinking. By 1809, Thomas Cochrane had become something unprecedented in naval warfare, a single captain whose activities had strategic implications far beyond his actual force. His frigate, One ship out of a Royal Navy fleet numbering hundreds was tying down thousands of French troops, disrupting commerce across the entire Mediterranean coast, and costing Napoleon's treasury millions in lost revenue and increased defensive expenditures. Napoleon's correspondence from this period reveals his growing obsession. In a letter to his naval minister Denis Decrès, dated March 1809, Napoleon wrote, "This Cochrane has done more damage to our commerce than any squadron. He appears everywhere. My admirals tremble at reports of his sail. Find him, destroy him. I care not how many ships it requires." Decrès tried. He really did. But hunting Cochrane was like trying to catch smoke. The standard French response to British frigates was to send out superior force, typically a ship of the line supported by frigates, to either capture or destroy the British vessel. This worked against conventional captains who would see a 74-gun ship of the line and sensibly retreat. Cochrane wasn't conventional. When French ships of the line came hunting for him, he would lead them on chases that lasted days, always staying just beyond cannon range, drawing them away from the convoys they were supposed to protect. Once the coast was clear, he would double back, raid the now undefended targets, and disappear before the French hunters could return. In June 1809, the French tried a different approach. Admiral Baudin, commanding the French Mediterranean squadron, assembled a trap. Intelligence reports, probably planted deliberately, suggested that a valuable British merchant convoy would be passing through the Gulf of Lion. Baudin positioned 3 frigates and a ship of the line to intercept. The convoy was bait. The real target was Cochrane, who was known to aggressively defend British merchant shipping. Baudin reasoned that Cochrane couldn't resist coming to the convoy's defense, and once engaged with the French frigates, the ship of the line would arrive and finish him. Cochrane saw through the trap immediately. The merchant convoy was sailing in an unnaturally perfect formation. The wind was wrong for the reported destination, and French frigates were visible on the horizon but not attacking, when any aggressive captain would have immediately engaged defenseless merchants. Instead of falling for it, Cochrane turned the trap inside out. He sent a boat under flag of truce to the merchant convoy, ostensibly to offer escort services. The boat captain reported back. These were French warships disguised as merchants, their gun ports painted over, false deckhouses constructed to mask their true nature. Cochrane sailed Impérieuse directly toward the disguised warships. The French, still hoping to maintain their deception until Cochrane was fully committed, held fire. At 400 yards, Cochrane suddenly turned broadside and fired a full broadside into the nearest merchant ship, which turned out to be a French frigate. The surprise was total. Before the French could return fire, Cochrane had come about and was sailing away at top speed. The French frigates, their deception blown, gave chase. This was exactly what Cochrane wanted. He led them on a stern chase, staying just ahead, apparently desperate to escape. The French, scenting blood, pursued aggressively, which meant they separated from their ship of the line, which was too slow to keep up. After 4 hours of chase, with the French frigates now 20 miles from their supporting ship of the line, Cochrane suddenly turned about and engaged. The lead French frigate, Ville de Milan, found herself suddenly fighting not a desperate fleeing enemy, but an aggressive opponent who'd been saving his crew's strength while the French had exhausted themselves in chase. The engagement lasted 40 minutes. Impérieuse's superior gunnery, Cochrane drilled his crews relentlessly, began to tell. Ville de Milan lost her foremast, then her mainmast. Dead in the water, she struck her colors. Cochrane took possession of the French frigate, put a prize crew aboard, and sailed both ships back toward Gibraltar before the other French vessels could interfere. He'd turned a trap designed to capture him into a humiliating defeat for the French Navy. Admiral Baudin's report to Napoleon blamed unprecedented trickery and refusal to engage honorably. Napoleon's response was tersely furious. "I do not pay you to be outsmarted by one British captain. This Cochrane makes fools of my entire navy. The Ville-de-Milan capture was significant beyond the immediate prize money, which made Cochrane wealthy. Captured enemy warships brought enormous rewards. It demonstrated that Cochrane had evolved beyond raiding and terror tactics into something more dangerous. He was now capable of defeating enemy frigates in single combat while simultaneously manipulating the broader tactical situation to his advantage. French and Spanish captains began refusing to engage when they spotted Imperieus's distinctive sail profile. This was almost unprecedented. Frigate captains were expected to be aggressive, but Cochrane's reputation now functioned as a force multiplier. Ships that should have fought instead retreated, leaving convoys and coastal installations undefended. In July 1808, the strategic situation shifted dramatically. Spain, previously France's ally, revolted against Napoleon's occupation. The Peninsular War began, a brutal guerrilla conflict that would ultimately drain 300,000 French troops, and, in Wellington's later assessment, begin the destruction of Napoleon's military reputation. The Royal Navy's role in the Peninsular War was crucial but often underappreciated. While Wellington's army fought the French in Portugal and Spain, the Navy ensured that the army remained supplied, that French coastal positions remained contested, and that Spanish guerrillas received weapons and support. Cochrane, operating off the Catalonian coast, saw opportunities everywhere. The French controlled Barcelona and the major coastal cities, but Spanish resistance controlled the countryside. French garrisons communicated via coastal roads, vulnerable to naval interdiction. French supplies moved by coaster, vulnerable to raiding. In September 1808, Cochrane received intelligence that a French army under General Duhesme was preparing to attack the Spanish fortress of Trinidad, a strategic position controlling the coastal road north of Barcelona. The fortress had a garrison of 500 Spanish soldiers, but was critically short of powder and shot. Standard procedure would have been for Cochrane to report this to his admiral and request support. Instead, he sailed Imperieuse directly to Trinidad, landed with his marines, met with the Spanish commander, and personally directed the fortress's defense. What followed was one of the strangest episodes in Cochrane's career. For 3 weeks, this Royal Navy captain effectively served as a Spanish army officer, organizing defenses, sighting guns, training artillerymen, and preparing for the French assault. When his own powder supplies ran low, he sent Imperieuse to raid French coastal batteries and steal their powder. The French attacked on September 28th with 6,000 troops against Trinidad's 500 defenders, plus Cochrane's 50 sailors and marines. The siege lasted 12 days. Cochrane's naval gunnery expertise proved invaluable. He positioned the Spanish guns to create interlocking fields of fire, calculated trajectories to maximize defensive coverage, and personally directed counter-battery fire against French siege guns. On October the 10th, General Duhesme withdrew, having lost over 800 men to Trinidad's 73 casualties. It was a stunning defensive victory, and Cochrane was directly responsible. But this was merely the beginning of Cochrane's peninsular involvement. Over the next year, he would repeatedly land, fight alongside Spanish guerrillas, train local forces in naval gunnery, and generally operate as a one-man joint operations force. His most effective tactic was the coastal raid in support of Spanish guerrilla operations. Spanish resistance forces would identify a French position, a depot, a communications post, a small garrison. They would send word to Cochrane, often via fishing boats. Cochrane would coordinate a joint attack. Spanish guerrillas would block the landward escape routes, while Imperieuse would bombard from the sea and land a raiding party. These operations drove the French to distraction. They were fighting a guerrilla war in the mountains and a naval war on the coast simultaneously, and somehow those two separate fronts kept coordinating against them. French coastal garrisons had to be massively reinforced to withstand potential naval bombardment, which meant fewer troops available for counter-guerrilla operations inland. In February 1809, Cochrane executed perhaps his most strategically important peninsular operation. French forces were besieging the fortress of Ruthless, a key Spanish stronghold. If Rosas fell, the French would control the entire Catalonian coast and could suppress Spanish resistance much more effectively. Cochrane sailed Imperios into Rosas harbor, a maneuver that should have been suicidal, as the harbor was surrounded by French-controlled shore batteries. But Cochrane had scouted the positions and identified a crucial flaw. The batteries were sighted to engage ships trying to enter or exit the harbor, not ships already inside maneuvering against ground targets. Imperios anchored in the harbor and became, in effect, a floating fortress supporting Rosas's defense. Her 38 guns could reach French siege positions that Rosas's own artillery couldn't hit. For 3 weeks, Imperios conducted counter-battery fire, destroying French siege guns, hitting ammunition dumps, and generally making the siege impossible to sustain. The French tried everything. They brought up heavy siege mortars and bombarded Imperios from the land. Cochrane responded by moving his ship's position every night, so the French had to recalculate their firing solutions each morning. They attempted a cutting-out expedition with boats, trying to board and capture Imperios at anchor. Cochrane's crew fought them off in a brutal nighttime engagement. On February 28th, the French finally brought up enough heavy guns to make Imperios's position untenable. Cochrane withdrew, but only after 3 weeks of supporting fire had allowed Spanish forces to reinforce Rosas sufficiently that it could withstand the siege. Rosas held for another month before finally falling, which was long enough for Spanish guerrillas to regroup and keep the resistance viable. Cochrane's peninsular operations were strategically brilliant, but created enormous problems with the Admiralty. He was supposed to be raiding French commerce and tying down enemy naval forces. Instead, he was functioning as an independent army commander, coordinating with Spanish forces and generally operating far outside normal naval chains of command. Admiral Lord Collingwood, commanding the Mediterranean fleet after Lord Keith's departure, sent Cochrane increasingly sharp letters demanding that he return to his assigned cruising station and stop playing at soldiers with the Spanish. Cochrane largely ignored these orders, reasoning correctly that his operations were having strategic impact far beyond normal frigate operations, and that Collingwood was too distant and too conventional to understand what Cochrane was achieving. This insubordination would ultimately cost Cochrane dearly, but in 1809 it didn't matter. He was winning, he was hurting Napoleon, and he was becoming famous throughout Britain as newspapers published accounts of his exploits. In April 1809, Cochrane faced his greatest challenge yet. The fortress of Fort Trinidad wasn't just a strong point, it was the keystone of French Mediterranean logistics. Located on a promontory overlooking the Catalan coast, Trinidad controlled the coastal road that was France's primary supply route for their armies in eastern Spain. Capturing or neutralizing Trinidad would sever French logistics and potentially force withdrawal from Catalonia entirely. Trinidad was also supposed to be completely impregnable from the sea. The fortress sat 300 feet above sea level on sheer cliffs. Its seaward-facing walls were 15 feet thick. It mounted 42 heavy guns sighted to destroy any ship that attempted to approach. A garrison of 200 French veterans, with ample supplies, held the fortress. The French engineer who designed Trinidad's defenses, General Chasseloup, had declared it could not be taken by naval force under any circumstances. Cochrane studied Trinidad for 5 days, sailing back and forth just outside cannon range, examining the fortress from every angle through his telescope. His officers assumed he was simply evaluating whether to recommend a land attack. They were wrong. Cochrane had identified a geometric absurdity in Trinidad's defenses. The fortress's guns were sighted to engage ships approaching from the sea, horizontal fire aimed at targets at sea level. But ships' guns fired on a flat trajectory too. They couldn't elevate sufficiently to hit targets significantly above sea level. Trinidad's designers had assumed this made the fortress invulnerable to naval bombardment. But what if you weren't trying to hit the fortress with direct fire? On the night of April 14th, Cochrane positioned Imperios at a precise distance from Trinidad. 1,200 yards, carefully measured. At that range, the fortress's guns could hit the ship, but only barely. More importantly, at maximum elevation, Imperieus's 18-pound guns could reach the fortress, not with direct fire, but with indirect fire, lobbing shot in a high parabolic arc that would drop down into the fortress's interior. At dawn, Imperieus opened fire. The technique was called plunging fire, shooting at high angles so the balls would drop almost vertically into the target. It was extraordinarily difficult. Gunners had to calculate trajectory, estimate wind, adjust for the ship's movement in the swell, and hope they'd aimed correctly because you couldn't see where the balls landed until they impacted. Cochrane had spent months training his gun crews in this technique, which most naval gunners considered a waste of time. Now it paid off. The bombardment lasted 3 hours. Imperieuse fired 312 rounds, almost her entire magazine. The French initially fired back, but their horizontal trajectory meant they were shooting at a target at extreme range, while Imperieus's plunging fire was landing inside Trinidad's courtyard, hitting barracks, ammunition stores, and garrison buildings. By 10 a.m., Trinidad's return fire had ceased. Cochrane sent a landing party ashore under flag of truce to offer terms. The French commander, seeing his fortress's interior systematically destroyed from a ship that was supposed to be unable to threaten him, surrendered. The Trinidad bombardment was tactically revolutionary. Cochrane had demonstrated that fortifications designed to be invulnerable to naval attack could be defeated through indirect fire, a technique that would become standard practice in naval warfare, but which in 1809 was completely unprecedented. The strategic impact was even greater. Trinidad's fall cut French logistics in Catalonia. General Suchet, commanding French forces in the region, had to withdraw from advanced positions and concentrate his forces closer to Barcelona. Spanish guerrillas, emboldened by the fortress's fall, intensified their operations. And Napoleon, receiving yet another report of Cochrane's success, reportedly threw an inkwell across his office and dictated a furious letter to his naval minister. "This British sea devil operates with impunity off our coasts. He takes fortresses. He defeats frigates. He arms Spanish rebels. He costs us millions. Why cannot even one French admiral destroy this man?" But success, ironically, was about to destroy Cochrane more completely than any French admiral could. In September 1809, Cochrane was recalled to Britain. The Admiralty, pressured by Admiral Collingwood's complaints about Cochrane's insubordination and irregular operations, decided to remove him from his command. Officially, this was a routine rotation. Unofficially, it was punishment for being too successful in the wrong way. Cochrane arrived in London in November 1809 as a national hero. Newspapers called him the Sea Wolf, the Scourge of France, and the Navy's greatest living captain. The public loved him. The Admiralty hated him. In early 1810, Cochrane committed what would become his greatest mistake. He entered politics. He ran for Parliament, representing the radical Whig faction, won election, and immediately began attacking naval corruption, incompetent admirals, and the prize money system that he believed cheated ordinary sailors. This made him powerful enemies. The establishment, the admirals, the politicians, the banking interests that profited from naval contracting saw Cochrane as a dangerous radical threatening their comfortable arrangements. In 1814, those enemies struck. Cochrane was implicated in a stock fraud scheme, the Great Stock Exchange fraud, where conspirators spread false news of Napoleon's death to manipulate stock prices. Cochrane's involvement was tangential at best. He had met one of the conspirators casually and happened to sell some stocks on the day in question. Modern historians generally agree Cochrane was innocent. But at trial, with the establishment determined to destroy him, he was convicted. The sentence was brutal: imprisonment, a ruinous fine, expulsion from Parliament, and most painfully, expulsion from the Royal Navy and removal of his knighthood. Cochrane, who had single-handedly terrorized Napoleon's coast, who, had captured ships and fortresses deemed impossible targets, was stripped of everything. The real reasons for his conviction had nothing to do with stock fraud. Cochrane had embarrassed powerful men, challenged naval orthodoxy, and demonstrated that individual genius could matter more than traditional hierarchy. The establishment couldn't accept this. After his release from prison, Cochrane left Britain in disgust. He took service with the Chilean Navy, 1818 to 1822, the Brazilian Navy, 1883 to 1825, and the Greek Navy, 1827 to 1828, commanding their naval forces in wars of independence. In each case, he applied the same tactics that had terrorized Napoleon: audacious raids, psychological warfare, innovative gunnery, an absolute refusal to accept conventional limitations. In Chile, he destroyed the Spanish fleet with ships manned by barely trained crews. In Brazil, he defeated a Portuguese squadron despite being outnumbered 3-1. In Greece, he helped secure independence from the Ottoman Empire. Everywhere he went, Cochrane won. Everywhere he went, he was eventually betrayed by the political interests he had helped. He finally returned to Britain in 1832, seeking restoration of his naval rank and knighthood. After years of campaigning, he was partially vindicated, restored to the Navy List in 1832, promoted to Rear Admiral in 1841, and finally granted a full pardon in 1847. But the great years were gone. By the time the Navy offered him command again, he was too old for active service. Thomas Cochrane died in 1860, age 85, having lived long enough to see many of his tactical innovations become standard naval practice. But he never commanded a British fleet in battle. He never became the first Sea Lord his abilities warranted. And he never received the recognition he deserved for fundamentally changing how naval warfare was conducted. So why has Cochrane faded from popular memory while Nelson remains immortalized? First, timing. Nelson died at Trafalgar, 1805, at the moment of his greatest triumph, providing the perfect martyrdom narrative. Cochrane lived into old age, his reputation tarnished by scandal and exile. Heroes who die young become myths. Heroes who die old become footnotes. Second, Trafalgar itself. Nelson's final battle was a decisive fleet action, capital ships in formal battle with clear strategic consequences, eliminating Franco-Spanish naval power for a generation. It fits the Hollywood version of naval warfare: massive ships, thundering broadsides, dramatic death scenes. Cochrane's victories were different. Small unit actions, raids, psychological warfare, innovations in gunnery and tactics. They were arguably more influential for the future of naval warfare, but they didn't provide the dramatic spectacle that makes for easy heroism. Third, class politics. Nelson was establishment. Younger son of a clergyman, but firmly embedded in the patronage networks that ran the Royal Navy. He didn't threaten the system. He succeeded within it. Cochrane was outside the establishment, challenged corruption, and paid for it with manufactured scandal and exile. The establishment that wrote the history books had every reason to minimize Cochrane's achievements. Fourth, complexity of context. Nelson's story is relatively straightforward. Brave admiral fights French and Spanish fleets, wins decisively, dies heroically. Cochrane's story requires understanding frigate warfare, coastal operations, joint operations with guerrillas, technical innovations in gunnery, and complex political conspiracies. It's a harder story to tell. Fifth, Cochrane's own personality. Nelson was politically astute, cultivated relationships with influential people, and understood how to manage his public image. Cochrane was caustic, confrontational, and seemingly incapable of compromising with authority figures he considered incompetent. This made him ineffective at protecting his own reputation. Sixth, the geographic scope. Nelson fought in the Mediterranean, the Atlantic, and at Trafalgar, areas of enormous strategic importance to British popular consciousness. Cochrane's most impressive work was in the Peninsular Campaign and off the Catalan coast, a sideshow in most British historical narratives, despite its strategic significance. Seventh, the scandal. The 1814 Stock Exchange conviction, regardless of actual guilt, permanently tarnished Cochrane's reputation. Once expelled from the Navy and Parliament, he became politically radioactive. Celebrating Cochrane meant validating someone the establishment had branded a criminal. Despite these factors, military historians have never forgotten Cochrane. The United States Naval Academy still teaches his tactics. Modern Special Operations Forces study his raids as case studies in asymmetric warfare. The British Submarine Service considers him a spiritual founder, small units operating independently, using stealth and audacity to achieve disproportionate impact. The technical and tactical innovations Cochrane pioneered became fundamental to modern naval warfare, even if his name isn't always attached to them. His use of plunging fire against fortifications anticipated the naval bombardment techniques used in both world wars. His emphasis on night operations and surprise attacks became standard doctrine for destroyers and submarines. His integration of naval power with land-based guerrilla forces prefigured modern joint operations and special forces tactics. His psychological approach to warfare, understanding that breaking enemy will was more important than destroying enemy material, anticipated modern military thinking about morale, initiative, and decision-making under stress. Perhaps most importantly, Cochrane demonstrated that the individual commander still mattered in an age of industrializing warfare. As armies and navies grew larger, as technology became more complex, as staff systems replaced personal leadership, Cochrane proved that one sufficiently brilliant, audacious, and unconventional officer could still change outcomes through sheer force of will and intelligence. Napoleon understood this better than most. In his memoirs, dictated on St. Helena, Napoleon wrote, "Cochrane could have taken me if he had been able to land 1,000 men at any point along the French coast. He harassed our coasts, destroyed our commerce, and cost us resources we desperately needed. In another age, with different circumstances, he might have been the greatest naval commander ever produced." That's quite an admission from the man who conquered most of Europe. Modern assessments have been more measured, but no less impressed. Naval historian Andrew Lambert called Cochrane the most brilliant frigate captain of the Napoleonic Wars and quite possibly of all time. Military theorist B.H. Liddell Hart wrote that Cochrane's tactical innovations in coastal warfare anticipated the development of special operations forces by over a century. The United States Navy, interestingly, has been more willing to celebrate Cochrane than the British. The Naval War College in Newport includes extensive case studies of Cochrane's operations. The destroyer tactics developed by the U.S. Navy in World War II, aggressive, independent operations by small, fast ships attacking heavier forces through surprise and maneuver, owe a direct debt to Cochrane's frigate tactics. Consider what might have happened if Cochrane had received proper recognition and support instead of exile and disgrace. In 1815, after Waterloo, Britain maintained the world's most powerful navy for a century. But British naval thinking ossified around the Trafalgar model: big ships, big battles, traditional tactics. The Royal Navy became conservative, resistant to innovation, wedded to traditions that served poorly in the industrial age. Cochrane represented a different path: innovation, asymmetric thinking, psychological warfare, joint operations. If he had commanded the Mediterranean fleet, trained a generation of officers in his methods, and influenced naval doctrine at the highest levels, Britain's naval development might have been radically different and more effective. Instead, the British Navy spent the 19th century building bigger and bigger battleships while relatively neglecting the small unit tactics, technological innovation, and asymmetric capabilities that would prove crucial in the 20th century. When World War I came, the Royal Navy was magnificent at set-piece battles and terrible at everything else. Convoy protection, anti-submarine warfare, coastal operations, joint amphibious operations. These were all areas where Cochrane had pioneered effective techniques a century earlier. It's impossible to know, of course. But it's worth considering that Britain's naval complacency between 1815 and 1914, the ossification that left the Royal Navy unprepared for modern warfare, might have been avoided if the establishment had embraced, rather than expelled, its most innovative thinker. In Culross, Scotland, a small plaque marks the birthplace of Thomas Cochrane, 10th Earl of Dundonald. It's modest, easy to miss, rarely visited. There's no grand memorial, no tourist site, no national monument. In Westminster Abbey, where Britain commemorates its greatest heroes, there's a small memorial tablet to Cochrane. It was erected 30 years after his death, grudgingly, after persistent lobbying by his supporters. It's tucked away in a corner, far from Nelson's prominent memorial. In Chile, Brazil, and Greece, Cochrane is celebrated as a national hero. Streets are named after him. Naval academies teach his tactics. Monuments commemorate his service. These countries, which he served as a mercenary after his own nation betrayed him, remember him better than Britain does. The British submarine service, interestingly, claims Cochrane as a spiritual ancestor. The submarine philosophy, small craft operating independently, using stealth and surprise to defeat superior forces, willing to take extraordinary risks for disproportionate impact, echoes everything Cochrane practiced in Speedy and Imperieuse. But ask most British people who Thomas Cochrane was, and you'll get blank stares. His direct descendants include the current Earl of Dundonald, who still campaigns for fuller recognition of his ancestors' achievements. There's a Cochrane Society that maintains his memory and promotes historical research. But these are niche interests, historical curiosities. Popular culture has occasionally rediscovered Cochrane. Patrick O'Brian's Aubrey Maturin novels, starting with Master and Commander, were inspired by Cochrane's career. The character Jack Aubrey is essentially Cochrane with the serial numbers filed off. The novel's success and the subsequent film starring Russell Crowe introduced Cochrane's exploits to a new generation, though most readers don't realize they're reading fictionalized history. Bernard Cornwell's naval adventure series features a protagonist explicitly modeled on Cochrane. Hornblower, C.S. Forrester's famous fictional captain, borrows heavily from Cochrane's biography. These popular tributes are fitting in a way. Cochrane lives on in fiction more vividly than in history. It's worth asking, what kind of man was Thomas Cochrane really? Contemporary accounts paint a complex picture. He was physically striking, 6'2" with red hair, powerfully built, impossible to miss in a crowd. He was intellectually brilliant, but socially awkward, capable of explaining complex mathematics, but utterly unable to engage in the small talk and social maneuvering that greased the wheels of Regency society. He was utterly fearless in combat, but apparently terrified of social situations. Multiple accounts describe him as tongue-tied at dinner parties, but coolly calculating under fire. He had a wicked sense of humor, but deployed it at inappropriate moments, making jokes that offended powerful men who could have been allies. He was absolutely incorruptible regarding money. He lived relatively modestly despite enormous prize money earnings, but completely corrupt regarding regulations, which he violated constantly in pursuit of what he considered strategic objectives. He seems to have been genuinely indifferent to his own safety, but deeply concerned about his crew's welfare. He demanded enormous risks from his men, but also ensured they were well-fed, well-paid, and properly cared for medically, unusual in an era when most captains treated sailors as disposable. His relationship with authority was catastrophic. He simply could not bring himself to defer to officers he considered incompetent, regardless of their rank. This meant he spent his career making enemies of admirals who could have helped him while cultivating the loyalty of subordinates who couldn't. His marriage, late in life to Catherine Barnes, his teenaged cousin, was apparently happy. They had 6 children. Catherine supported him through his scandals, exile, and decades-long campaign for rehabilitation. Their letters suggest genuine affection and partnership. His political views were radical for the time. He believed in merit over birth, in rational organization over tradition, in honesty over expedient corruption. These views made him powerful enemies and contributed directly to his downfall. In another age, they might have made him a revolutionary. In Regency Britain, they made him unemployable. Strip away the specific historical context, and Cochrane's career teaches several universal principles that remain relevant today. First, genius matters. There's a school of historical thought that minimizes the role of individuals, arguing that large-scale forces, economics, demographics, technology, determine outcomes regardless of who happens to be in command. Cochrane's career demolishes this argument. One sufficiently brilliant individual, in the right place with sufficient autonomy, can achieve results far beyond what systems-level analysis would predict. Second, orthodoxy is often wrong, but challenging it has costs. Every naval manual said a sloop couldn't capture a frigate. Every tactical doctrine said fortresses couldn't be reduced by indirect naval fire. Every strategic assessment said one frigate couldn't tie down thousands of enemy troops. Cochrane proved all of this wrong, but the establishment punished him for it. Innovation is possible, but innovators should expect resistance. Third, the establishment protects itself. Cochrane threatened comfortable arrangements, the prize money system, the patronage networks, the assumption that birth mattered more than ability. The establishment eventually found a pretext to destroy him. This pattern repeats throughout history. True innovators rarely receive recognition from the systems they threaten. Fourth, timing matters enormously. If Cochrane had died at age 35, killed in action after capturing Gamo or bombarding Trinidad, he would have been immortalized like Nelson. Living long enough to be betrayed, exiled, and partially rehabilitated made his story complicated. Heroes need clean narratives. Fifth, sometimes individual actions matter enormously. At certain pivot points in history, what one person does can actually change outcomes. Cochrane's campaign in the Mediterranean didn't win the Napoleonic Wars. Wellington and the Russian Winter did that. But Cochrane's operations in Spain helped sustain the Peninsular resistance, which drained French resources, which contributed to Napoleon's eventual defeat. Individual actions can matter, even if they're not solely determinative. Sixth, documentation matters. Nelson had a genius for self-promotion, wrote eloquent dispatches, cultivated relationships with influential writers. Cochrane wrote terse reports, alienated the press, and made enemies of potential biographers. History isn't just about what you do, it's about who writes the story afterward. In the end, Thomas Cochrane deserves to be remembered not just for what he did, though his achievements were extraordinary, but for what he represented. The possibility that one sufficiently audacious individual, thinking differently, can change outcomes that seem predetermined. Remember the morning of April 3rd, 1801, when HMS Speedy turned toward Gamo despite impossible odds. Remember the captain who understood that naval warfare was fundamentally psychological and that violating enemy expectations was worth more than superior firepower. Remember 3 years of terror inflicted on Napoleon's coast by one frigate and a crew of believers. Remember the fortress that couldn't be taken by naval force until someone tried indirect fire. Remember the Spanish guerrillas who received support from a British captain who should have stayed in his lane. Remember the establishment that couldn't tolerate excellence from outside its social networks. Remember the 30 years of exile, fighting for other nations' independence, applying the same principles that had terrorized Napoleon to help Chile, Brazil, and Greece achieve freedom. Remember the old man finally returning home, partially vindicated but never fully recognized. Remember that sometimes at critical moments, individual actions matter enormously, that genius can overcome systems, that one person thinking differently can accomplish the impossible, and that establishments will often punish rather than celebrate those who demonstrate these truths. Thomas Cochrane terrorized Napoleon's coast, reinvented frigate warfare, pioneered joint operations, and proved that audacity plus intelligence could defeat superior force. He was, quite simply, one of the most brilliant naval officers who ever lived. This is our history, and it's worth remembering. The date was April 3rd, 1801. The man was Thomas Cochrane. The achievement was proving that impossible was just another word for difficult. And somewhere, in some parallel timeline where merit matters more than birth and innovation is celebrated rather than punished, Admiral of the fleet Lord Cochrane commands fleets, trains generations of officers in audacious thinking, and stands alongside Nelson in the pantheon of naval immortals. In our timeline, we got a plaque in a Scottish village and a story almost nobody knows. That tells you everything you need to know about how history remembers its inconvenient heroes.